and so I thought I might share the path that I took to get there. So for me, I actually started in college studying chemistry, right? I thought I wanted to be a doctor, so I did all the things, right? You do the volunteer experience, you shadow physicians, shadow technologists, like different departments, like understood generally how the hospital worked. And so one summer, I was doing research in this biomedical lab, and I realized that 80% of the work that I was doing could have been done by software. And no one in my lab cared to actually purchase the software, and no one knew how to build the software. So I knew that if I wanted to continue down the biomedical research path, I would need to build the software myself, or it wouldn't get done, right? So I go back to my campus. I was studying at the moment, at that time, at the University of California, Davis. So I switched my major to computer science because I'm like, I need to learn how to build the software, or I'm gonna be like doing tedious tasks forever. So I do that, and I spent 2 quarters, we're on the quarter system there, so I spent 2 quarters studying computer science, and I just felt like it was all theory. Like I knew how to like write algorithms, but I didn't have any projects, right? And I didn't know how to consume APIs. I didn't even really know what APIs were, and I was like, this is insane. And so at the same time, off campus, so my school is sort of near Sacramento, and in Palo Alto, so in the Valley, they have a think tank, which is kind of like this group of community leaders and thought experts who think about the future. So I was working with Institute for the Future, and I spoke on 2 panels. One was the future of learning, and the other was the future of work. So there were all of these like experts in the field who thought about like what might the future look like. Some people proposed like transcripts on the blockchain, or thinking about like project-based learning, or thinking about what if you want to study agriculture, and instead of reading about it in a book, you actually go work on a farm for 4 months, and then you get to grow the vegetables, and you get to do this entire process, like hands-on. So I was like, that sounds interesting. And on that same time, there was a panel. On the panel that I was speaking on, there were 2 directors of General Assembly. And General Assembly, some people in the States kind of like refer to it as the finishing school for like the United States elite. So a lot of people who go to private colleges or Ivies, they end up going to General Assembly when they graduate, which is like a coding boot camp. So I know we were just working with like Go Code right here, and that's like the coding boot camp out here. And when I learned about it, I was like, what? There's like a coding boot camp where you can build like projects and you like actually learn how to build stuff? I'm gonna go to that. So what I did, and for me, I did not have the cash to like be able to afford to go, but I applied for scholarships and I was awarded one. So I worked with an organization called Yes We Code, who tries to build pipelines for underrepresented minorities and women to enter technology. So they paid for me to go through Dev Bootcamp, and I finished that, and it was cool, right? Like I had projects. I knew generally how to build things, but actually when I got in front of my computer and I was ready to like build something that I thought of, I got stuck, and I was like, oh no, I feel like I have a question right now. I don't know what to do. And so like what I did is I'm like, okay, how can I continue my learning? Like I just feel like it wasn't enough. And so I applied for another boot camp, and luckily I got Adobe to grant me a scholarship to go through Dev Bootcamp. So that was really cool as well. So I basically went through 2 coding boot camps, and at that time, like my GitHub, after I finished both of the boot camps, I had experience in like project management, in database design. I had like 40 projects. Some of them were collaborative projects, some of them were independent projects, and I learned a lot about documentation. So reading documentation and documenting my own projects, so it made employers, it was like really easy to figure out what I did, what I understood, what I learned, like what I could build, the languages that I knew. It was very well documented, right? So after I did that, I was like, all right, I feel like I have the skill set now where I could actually go and like contribute to a company, and so I did. So what I did is I did an internship with Intel, and I worked in an internal group. It's like the platform architecture group, and I built an API off of their database. And so the interesting thing about Intel, it's a hardware company, right? But I'm a software engineer, and at that time, all I knew was like web development. So I had, everyone on my team was like an electrical engineer, like everyone. There were no software people, no one could like help me debug anything. And even the project manager who I was working with at the time, he didn't really understand what I was building. Like he knew the deliverable that he wanted, and he knew like how generally it should look, but he didn't know like how to get there. So we had to consistently consult other teams, other web dev teams to say like, hey, can you help me build this? But the cool thing about that was I had full autonomy on how I could execute. So I got to choose my own tech stack. I got to choose like APIs that I would use, like different packages, node packages, right? So the first thing that I want you guys to take away from this talk is the importance of asking questions. So because I was on that team and no one else knew really what I was building, it was a lot of like, I'm talking to someone and they tell me what they want. Like, I want a piece of paper, right? But there's so many other questions you could ask. I want, what color paper do you want? Like, what texture of paper do you want? Does this paper need to have lines? Like, how large or small should the paper be? And those are things that I did not understand when I started, right? And so initially, I got this project spec that's like, hey, we want this certain deliverable, which was just this the API off of the database. But no one on my team knew how much data they owned. Like the architects had products that they owned, right? And they knew that there was data in the database from those products, but they did not understand how much. They didn't know where, and they didn't even understand how large Intel's database was, because they only had one. So it was my responsibility to go figure out answers to all of those questions. And what that meant for me was literally going to track down the guy who owns the database in the company, like finding him on their like internal tool, and having like, I probably spent like 40 hours with him understanding the database, because that particular database was 500,000 tables. And it was up to me to figure out how to find the data that no one has ever seen. So like, it was overwhelming and it was amazing, but I did learn that even if a question seems dumb, and even if it seems like, oh, this is intuitive, everyone understands, like actually probably most people don't understand, and even the guy who wrote the database, sometimes he doesn't even know what he wrote. So that's takeaway number one. Just, there is no stupid question, right? So let's move on. So after that, I was pretty like optimistic at that time. Like I felt like, hey, you know, if I can get one internship, I can get two. If I can get two, I can get three. So on to the next one. After that one, I went to Intuit. And so they're like a financial company. They basically own all of the accounting software. So they own like QuickBooks, QuickBooks Online. They own QBSC, Mint, which is, does anyone here use Mint or know what it is? Or yeah, okay, awesome, yeah, cool. So yeah, so I worked for them, and I worked specifically, I knew that, I knew I wanted to go into data, right? I was really good at database design, and I found that out through boot camp. But I didn't really understand much else, and I knew there was so much more. Like from that project, when I ended that project with Intel, and oh, this is really important. So I ended that project with Intel, and I actually get my API like completed. I found all the data, but I run my query, and it returned 9 billion records, right? So the server crashes, like everything breaks, and then my manager's like, where's my data? I'm like, everything broke, right? So I actually went to go consult a data scientist. This is at Intel on another team. And I'm like, how do I get this to work? And she's like, basically, you need to use like HDFS, Hadoop, distributed systems. And I didn't know what any of that was. It was like gibberish. But what I did, I like go online to Coursera and I'm like, HDFS, teach me. And virtually like from there, I started to understand like what it was. So I generally knew I wanted to go to a database team. So when I'm talking to Intuit, I'm like, put me on a data engineering team. I want to do machine learning. Even though like I just pitched it like, yeah, I know how to do database design. I'd never done any data engineering, no data science, nothing about machine learning. I was just like, I want that team. And they're like, all right, cool. So like, I go to this team, and basically my mentor is a woman who's like, she was like computer science, MIT. She was like senior software engineer, really, really like type A, meticulous, like knows all of the things, right? And she's the person who I'm working under. And virtually what my entire internship is just like doing some of her tasks. So like they weren't easier because I was like an intern or I didn't know anything. They were just like, yeah, you can just take half of her workload. So that's what I did. And there's just a lot of like ramp up that happens there. So virtually like my title was like analyst, right? Except the way that analysts function on the categorizations team at Intuit is more like, a project manager will give you some sort of deliverable and say, hey, I generally want to understand how many transactions are coming in and how many are not. Like, how many transactions are being categorized from the ones that are coming in. Like, go figure that out. I make some sort of visualization on how this works. And it is up to you, the analyst, to do your own ETL, right? So you need to be a data engineer. You also need to be a data visualization expert, and at the time they weren't using any sort of like Databricks or Spark or Scala. It was just like, hey, we're using Hive, like only Hive. And so if you're using Hive in like distributed computing, it is slow. Like every time I tried to like run a query, like test it, it's like 9 hours later I understand if like it failed, if it did not fail. And just for reference, like the woman who I'm working under, like to run one of her like pipelines was like it might have been like 700 lines of SQL. And she's like, hey, just look at one of my examples. And I was like, oh, is it just the first part? She said, no, it's the whole thing. I was like, oh. She's like, go for it. Like, you can do it. I'm like, I'm going to be here for 3 months. I don't know what any of this, I don't know what any of this is. So I would also say like the takeaway that I got from that is break it down into like reasonable chunks, right? Like clearly like she knew like you're only going to be here 3 months, and also she's like a super senior engineer. She can do this like in her sleep. Takes her like 20 minutes to do the whole project. It took me like 3 months to learn how to do all the things, right? But like by literally scheduling meetings with her and understanding like, okay, like this small piece, like explain partitions to me, like I don't get it. Like talk to me like I'm 2 or like 3 or something, and really break it down into like English, right? Because she's speaking like Hive 7.0 and I'm on like, HIV. So, but okay, so takeaway number 2. And then I think just the fact that I went from like going from web dev to data science is a really big jump. And I literally made that jump by supplementing the work experience that I had with Coursera. Like Coursera, there's actually a data scientist. There was only one data scientist on my team when I was at Intuit, but his recommendation to me was that like, hey, I don't think you actually, like he had his PhD in operations research, but he's like, I don't think that you actually need to do that. I think that if you want to go into data science, you should take these like 3 courses on Coursera and then come back, because that's all you need to know. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I learned from that experience and from the next experience at Intuit, like I can actually learn a ton on my own, like online, right? So I kept learning through that internship, and those 2 that I got, I was a part of a fellowship, and with that fellowship, we got 1 year of like unlimited access to all of the data science courses, all of the computer science courses, and all of the like business intelligence analytics courses on Coursera, like free certificates basically for a year. And I was like, this is gold. I'm taking the year off. I'm just gonna do Coursera. And like out of nowhere, like it was like a week after I made that decision, like the chief data scientist at Acorns reached out to me and sent me a personal message like, hey, I really want you to like help me with this project. And I'm like looking at his profile and I'm like, me? Like me? Like, you know, and he's like, you. Like, so, you know, like I fly out to LA, I meet with his team, and the next week, like I'm like a remote intern on an actual data science team. You know, after literally 6 months before, I was a web developer. Like, and I had my first internship. So, like, joining that team, it is also really interesting, right? So when you enter the space of data, like, especially for a large corporation, it is pretty important to understand generally, like, product-focused things about the company or like the industry. And this doesn't necessarily have to do with any sort of like machine learning algorithms or even anything technical. It's literally about understanding like why you are building what you are building. And you can get that from talking to a project manager whose job it literally is to understand that, right? Like they have and own that product. And as a data person, it is pretty important to understand what they understand, because you have to go a step further and ask questions that they did not think to ask. Like that is your job. And so that is what I learned from the data science internship, that like I have a general idea of the subtopic that I'm focused on. Like, I owned a food labeling project that even as an intern was like just as important as the senior data scientist project. Like, someone else was working on bank fees, but bank fees are just as important as like food transactions. Like, it wasn't like, oh, intern, small project, no one cares about this. Like, I literally had to do the same report that like everyone else had to do. I had to present to like everyone the same as everyone else. And so I will say that that is something I do see that's a little bit different in data science and analytics as opposed to web development or more like software engineering positions, where it's like the ramp up time is maybe a little slower or different, I would say. Like, the ownership that you take in your project and the deliverables are maybe more immediate or more well, they're actually not concrete. It's a lot. It's so in a lot of ways, my projects were pretty well defined, yet the deliverables were more questions. So like, I started with a question and actually ended with a different question. Like, I started that internship with a question like, how are people spending money on food in general, in the food related categories? I ended the internship literally asking like, how do we implement customer segmentation? Because what your customers want is to understand overall how they're spending money in all of the categories, and how you can tell them specifically what categories are problematic for them and how can they improve their spending. And it's like I started with a question and I ended with a question. And that is usually, like, in all of the experiences that I've had, that is what has happened. It's like you're jumping from question to question and trying to dive deeper into what you don't understand and specifically what someone else doesn't understand, so that you can hopefully like guide them with data or other questions and help them realize what they don't understand, like see the unknown virtually. So now I am helping the Developer Circles program understand how we can better serve developers. Like, we want to understand, what do developers care about? Is that like content? What are developers talking about? How does that differ by region? How does that differ by language? Like, how does that differ by technology? Like, really, what could we do to improve the lives of developers? And it's a very complicated question, and there's a ton of data affiliated with that, and that is what I'm working on now. So I tried to tell my story and give some high-level learnings. Does anyone have any questions about that, or any questions for me in general? Well, I'll be here then.